It's a little cozy up here. My name is Mary Ellen Robertson, and I completed a master's degree in women's studies in religion at the Claremont Graduate University. And I was drawn to this program because it allowed me to explore my interests both in women's studies and feminism and religion at the same time. And nearly all of my research while I was in the program focused on women in Mormonism, and I was especially interested in women's activities in early church history. And I wrote my master's thesis about Mormon women's historical relationship with spiritual gifts and priesthood authority, focusing on the Kirtland and Nauvoo periods because of the many meaningful ways in which Mormon women were involved in the church's growth and development. Many early converts were drawn to Mormonism because the theology embraced spiritual gifts and continuing revelation. When it came to using spiritual gifts in the early 1830s and 40s, Mormon women and men acted in much the same way. They prayed to receive guidance, they anointed, laid on hands, and pronounced healing blessings on the sick. They spoke in tongues or acted as interpreter for others who spoke in tongues. And during the Kirtland period, women were witnesses and participants in the many public displays of spiritual gifts during church meetings and especially at the Kirtland Temple dedication. And women exercised these gifts both in public and private settings. And I'll give a couple of examples because I think this is where the history really connects with people. In an account dated October 31st, 1833, 21-year-old Lydia Bailey spoke in tongues in front of a group gathered to visit with Joseph Smith. And here's the account. The family were all seated around the wide, old-fashioned fireplace in the parlor, listening to the prophet's words and full of rejoicing. I would be so glad if one who has been baptized could receive the gift of tongues, as the ancient saints did, and speak to us, said Moses Nickerson. If one of you shall rise up and open your mouth, it shall be filled, and you shall speak in tongues, replied the prophet. Everyone then turned, as by common instinct, to Lydia and said with one voice, Sister Lydia, rise up. And then the great glory of God was manifested to this weak but trusting girl. She was enveloped as with a flame, and, unable longer to retain her seat, she arose, and her mouth was filled with the praises of God and his glory. The spirit of tongues was upon her. There is no indication in this example, or many others, that age or gender was a barrier to receiving spiritual manifestations, and the group, which included Joseph Smith, seemed nonplussed that the gift of tongues was given to a weak but trusting girl. Some Mormon women also took part in healing the sick, often administering to sick family members, but their healing activities would often extend beyond their immediate families. In one early example, Sarah Sturtevant Levitt converted to Mormonism and moved to the Kirtland area in July 1835. Sarah's daughter Louisa had been sick for a year prior to the family's arrival in Kirtland. Once they had settled there, their neighbors, believing the family was withholding medical care from Louisa, were intent on confiscating the family's team of horses to pay for a doctor. Sarah wrote in her journal, I lay pondering on our situation, thinking we should be undone if our team was taken from us, and prayed earnestly to the Lord to let us know what we should do. There was an angel stood by my bed to answer my prayer. He told me to call Louisa up and lay my hands upon her head in the name of Jesus Christ and administer to her, and she should recover. Her mind was weak indeed, but she got up, and I administered to her in faith, having the gift from the Lord. It was about midnight when this was done, and she began to recover from that time and was soon up and about. Sarah's instructions from an angelic messenger enabled her to heal her daughter when medical remedies had proved ineffective. Sarah's autobiography mentions her belief in spiritual gifts promised after baptism, which she felt was missing from other religions, but which she found in abundance in Mormonism. Much more happened in Kirtland than time will allow me to relate, and I wanted to definitely mention the Nauvoo period, because this inaugurated Mormon women's more formal incorporation into the institutional structure of the church. While Mormon women were active, faithful churchgoers from the beginning, initially there was no formal women's organization in the church for the first 12 years it existed. The creation of the Nauvoo Female Relief Society in 1842, the church's first organization for women, and women's participation in sacred temple rituals beginning in 1840, marked an enlargement of Mormon women's roles. Not only did Mormon women make charitable contributions to the community through the Relief Society, but their more active role also had significant spiritual ramifications. Their activities paralleled those of the priesthood, and the governing body of the Relief Society mirrored the structure of priesthood government. In his efforts to organize the women, Joseph Smith suggested they elect a president and that the presiding officer choose 2 counselors to assist in the duties of her office. The women nominated and elected Emma Smith to the position of president, and she chose Sarah Cleveland and Elizabeth Ann Whitney as her counselors. And this paralleled exactly the structure of the leadership in the church, with Joseph Smith serving as president with 2 counselors. Continuing the parallels between the Relief Society and the priesthood, Joseph Smith said, quote, "Hello." Thank you. Let there be light. Joseph Smith said, quote, he would ordain them to preside over the society and let them preside just as presidency preside over the church, unquote. The women leaders were told they should fill the office with dignity, like the first presidency of the church. Smith continued saying that if additional leaders were necessary to carry out the Relief Society's business, let them be appointed and set apart as deacons and teachers, etc., are among us, using the familiar names of priesthood offices. The officers of the Relief Society were then ordained to their leadership positions by church leader John Taylor. At a later meeting with the society, Joseph Smith amplified the similarities between the Relief Society and priesthood organizations, saying that the Relief Society should move according to the ancient priesthood. Hence, there should be a select society, separate from all the evils of the world, choice, virtuous, and holy. Said he was going to make of this society a kingdom of priests, as in Enoch's day, and as in Paul's day. Joseph Smith continued to meet with the newly founded Relief Society, giving instruction for the benefit of the members and discussing doctrinal and spiritual subjects with the growing group of women. The weekly meetings of the Nauvoo Female Relief Society provided opportunities for Mormon women to render service and to learn more about doctrinal principles. Not only was the Relief Society a place where women could attend to practical matters and render charitable service, it was also a place where the women involved were able to exercise their gifts of the Spirit that had been so prominent among the saints in Kirtland. In several Relief Society meetings, women spoke and interpreted tongues, and in other cases used the laying on of hands to bless and heal illnesses. And a number of these events were recorded in the Relief Society's minutes. For example, during the April 19, 1842 Relief Society meeting, one woman expressed her gratitude for a healing blessing. The meeting's minutes read, Mrs. Durfee bore testimony to the great blessing she received when administered to after the close of the last meeting by President Emma Smith and counselors Cleveland and Whitney. She said she never realized more benefit through any administration, that she was healed, and thought the sisters had more faith than the brethren. Mrs. Durfee's experience with spiritual gifts in the Relief Society was not unique. There were many instances of blessings and laying on of hands and speaking in tongues that were recorded in these minutes. And the women understood that their spiritual exercises had the approval of Joseph Smith, similar to the way that Mormon men exercised spiritual gifts as part of their priesthood meetings and duties. Joseph Smith spoke about the use of spiritual gifts in many Relief Society meetings and discussed the place of spiritual gifts in the church, especially when confronted with rumors and murmurings about what the women were doing. He addressed some of these remarks. There were people saying that it wasn't right what the women were doing, laying the hands on the sick and healing them. And Smith quickly went on record indicating that the women were acting within the bounds of propriety. He said, "No matter who believeth, these signs, such as healing the sick, casting out devils, etc., should follow all that believe, whether male or female." He asked the society if they could not see by this sweeping stroke that wherein they are ordained, it is the privilege of those set apart to administer in that authority, which is conferred on them. And if the sisters should have the faith to heal the sick, let all hold their tongues and let everything roll on. Smith further clarified his remarks about women's practices of healing, specifying that divine power lay behind such actions and that faith was required of both parties. He said, respecting the female's laying on of hands, he further remarked, there could be no devil in it if God gave his sanction by healing, that there could be no more sin in any female laying hands on the sick than in wetting the face with water. It is no sin for anybody to do it that has faith, or if the sick has faith to be healed by the administration. So I take that as a pretty strong green light. Smith left no room for doubt about his approval of these activities. As long as women had sufficient faith to heal or to be healed, and God sanctioned their work by allowing the healing to take place, there was nothing Smith considered improper about the women's activities. I don't have time to tell as many stories about women's healing practices as I would like, but these stories speak to me not only because I have an interest in women's history and in women's roles in religion, but because to me they demonstrate a larger role for women within Mormonism and a ministerial function I believe that ordination would expand on for women believers. I would like to see all LDS women be able to use all of their spiritual gifts to bless and serve their families, each other, and their, or really our, church. Thank you.